Of the 5 inmate deaths in Duval County so far this year, 2 were from fentanyl overdoses. Keeping drugs out of the jail is the reason officials say that they have ended in person visits for good. And to talk about it, I'm joined now by Nichole Manna, investigative reporter for the Jacksonville Tributary. Good morning, Nichole.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here. We're also joined by Andrew Bonderud, civil rights and criminal defense attorney here in Jacksonville. Good morning, Andrew.
Good morning.
So, Nichole, start us, if you will, by catching us up on the in custody fatalities, some of which occurred in the jail and some of which did not. But this is an issue that you've been reporting on now for more than a year.
Yes, so I have been tracking deaths that have happened specifically within the jail, since I started at the Tributary a year ago. So to catch us up on the numbers, in 2023, there were 16 deaths in the jail. So far this year, I have counted 5 that we know of. There was one more person who died, from what it sounds like, after his arrest. I think he was arrested and then sent to the hospital and died there. So that would be considered an in-custody death. And so that would technically bring us to 6, but at least 5 people who had been physically in the jail have died this year.
And we mentioned a couple of those from fentanyl. How are you able to determine how they died, and what significance does that have?
Yeah, so the way I determine it, and have been since 2023 really, is putting in record requests through the medical examiner's office. So anybody who dies in the jail or in custody will get a autopsy, and so those autopsies will tell us how somebody died. So my process is we learn about a death, and then I wait a couple days, I wait a week, just to make sure that autopsy is getting processed, and then I send an email to the medical examiner asking for the results of that autopsy. Of the 5 that I've tracked this year of jail deaths, I've actually only asked for 2 autopsies so far, and they were the 2 people who died in February, and both came back as fentanyl overdoses. And since 2022, of all the autopsies that we've gotten from the medical examiner's office, this brings our total of people who died with fentanyl in their systems to 8.
Okay. So this is an issue of drugs getting into the jail. What is the timeline that you look at in terms of whether those are people coming into the facility, perhaps overdosing, versus somebody who is in the facility and overdosing with a drug that presumably they got in the facility?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think the timeline is just a matter of days. If somebody is arrested and then they die that day or the next day and fentanyl is in their system, I think it's possible we could say, maybe they ingested that before they got to the jail. With the 2 deaths that have happened this year, one of them died 3 months after he was arrested, and one died 5 days after she was arrested. So those, I think you could point to, they likely got them within the facility, especially that man who had been incarcerated for 3 months.
Andrew Bonderud, you go to the jail quite a bit. You have a lot of clients there.
I sure do.
How has the policy change in terms of visits impacted you, impacted your clients, impacted your interaction? And we should say this the initial change came during COVID as a result of the health precautions.
Right. With respect to attorney visits of inmate clients, I have not seen a significant change. I'm still able to go to the jail, visit with my clients in a contact room, not between glass. Here in Jacksonville, that's permitted. In other jails, it's not permitted. Other parts of the state. So the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office still allows attorneys pretty unfettered access around the clock, and they do a really good job of enabling attorneys to be able to have the meetings with the clients that we need to be able to have at our convenience. With respect to family visitations, I understand that there has been a change in the last few years. Although I would note, as far as I can tell, the change to virtual video chat, FaceTime type visitation with family is a change from between glass visitation, where the family could see the inmate but then still had to talk on the telephone between glass. So that's the change. As far as I
So
as
it
far
wasn't
as I
necessarily like
recall,
a contact visit anyway.
correct.
It was separated by plexiglass.
That's right. I'm not aware, and I can be corrected. I'm not aware of any contact visits having been allowed historically in the recent past.
I want to ask you about other people working on a defendant's case because you say attorneys have been permitted this unfettered access. What about private investigators, paralegals that may need to meet with one of your clients? Are they also given that same type of access?
Um, it, Also, in my experience, I have had very little difficulty having my staff accompany me into the jail. Um, I'm bilingual. My staff is bilingual. And sometimes when I have a Spanish speaking client who speaks maybe a unique dialect, I like to have, a backup Spanish speaker. And all it takes is a letter from me saying, I'd like to have my paralegal accompany me into the jail. And the corrections officers who work at the jail are at least the ones that I've interacted with have not given me any trouble, you know, allowing me in, allowing me to have my staff come in with me, and we've been able to meet without trouble.
And yet, this policy, our friends over at First Coast News did a story just this last week about a woman who was complaining about the video access only, saying that her elderly father wasn't able to master the technology and she hadn't been able to be in contact with him. Are there any constitutional implications if that is the case?
So let me caveat this at the outset that there are some things that I'm constrained by. I am a candidate for judicial office right now, and so I can't really comment on specific cases. But I will say, in generalities, there are some courts of appeals that have addressed the question of what are the contours of the inmate's constitutional rights to visitation. And, for some, it might be a distinction without a difference, but for pretrial inmates, it's actually not an Eighth Amendment question because the Eighth Amendment deals with cruel and unusual punishment, and for pretrial inmates, punishment is not allowed. They're not being punished. They are there as a
Theoretically,
pretrial.
right? They're confined and not being punished.
Exactly. So it's
Although it certainly feels punitive to people inside,
right,
right? Yeah.
for sure. And the standard that's been promulgated by other courts of appeals is that as you know, the baseline is that an inmate's visitation rights cannot be permanently and arbitrarily suspended. And so that, of course, you could imagine when trying to craft, judge-made law, they have to keep it at high-level generalities. So does that, does visitation include contact, or is telephone and video sufficient?
And is there case law on that?
And so, not that I have found, but I suspect that this really becomes more of a policy question than a question of the contours of the Bill of Rights, which was, drafted centuries ago when, the punishment for all felonies was the death penalty. So I think things have evolved over time, and really it's a question for policymakers, not judges.
Nichole, you've reported in other places before coming to Jacksonville for the Tributary, and this change was attributed to COVID, and then it's a policy they've just decided to continue with. But you've seen it in other places implemented for other reasons.
Yeah, it's interesting to me that Jacksonville just implemented it due to COVID, because I worked in Wichita long before COVID in 2017 and 2018. And the only way for me to interview inmates there was also through a video system. And I don't exactly know why that policy was there. It could be, to make sure contraband is not coming in. That would make sense. But the way it worked is I would schedule a meeting with an inmate. I would show up to the jail. I would sit in this little chair, and I would essentially be looking at a TV, talking to them that way.
If you're just joining us, we are talking about jail policy when it comes to visitation and also efforts through that policy to stem the flow of illegal drugs into the jail. You can join our conversation by calling 904-549-2937. You can also email First Coast Connect at wjct.org, or you can reach out on social media. Part of the issue of video visitation, Nichole, is, is it enough to be able to just visit through, a video screen? And I think there's some people that say, particularly for children, that can be a difficult interaction. It can also be more convenient. I mean, family members are allowed to do these video calls. They don't have to go to the jail. They can do them from home, but it costs.
It does. So I did a quick search on the sheriff's office website just to learn about the programming that they use. If you were to go into the jail here in Duval County and do this video system, it's free. But according to their website, if you were to call in almost like a FaceTime, it would be 25 cents a minute that you would be paying to talk to that inmate.
Hmm. And once you're there, you can visit sort of like pre-COVID rules. It is limited still to just one visit a week, whether it's video or in this, if you're at the jail.
If you're physically at the jail, yes.
That's right. Are there concerns about these costs? I know other municipalities, other places have been concerned about whether the agency that issues contracts to this private provider of video service whether the agency is receiving any money in return, whether they're benefiting from those services, and whether the prices are too high.
Yeah, so there's actually been some coverage out of Michigan that I just read when I was catching up on this. There's been a lawsuit filed there accusing the jail, the county, and the telecom service of getting kickbacks from these services and basically incentivizing sheriffs to then continue to use these services because they're making money off of it. In that case, families were paying about $13 for a 20-minute virtual visit. There's been no lawsuits filed here locally, but I think that is like one way that we have seen lawsuits come out because you're not necessarily suing on an infringement of rights, you're suing on these kickbacks. And to be clear, it looks like the company in Michigan that is being sued is not the company that JSO is using.
Have you requested some information about that?
Yes, I requested the contract through JSO and was directed back to the city. Apparently, they are the ones that have that. So I have filed that request. I haven't got it yet.
Okay. One of the reasons that this change is supposed to help, Andrew, is because there are ways of getting drugs into jail that are more advanced, perhaps, than they've ever been, including, kind of pasting paper with drugs like fentanyl and using, the pass through of documents, perhaps, or letters, communications to get those drugs inside. So this is, particularly for like the deaths that Nichole was mentioning, would presumably help cut down on that. And that is a serious risk.
100%. I anticipate that, I don't want to speak specifically about the Duval County Jail, but I suspect that any county sheriff would say, on one hand, you want unfettered access and open lines of communication between inmates and their families. But then when contraband gets in and people get hurt or, other bad things happen, the sheriff is to blame. And I think most sheriffs are probably in a position of trying to balance these interests, and which is why, again, maybe really the balancing is for the policymakers and the legislators to make the decision about where to strike that balance. I will also say that before the advent of remote video visitation technology, I have a client right now, for example, whose family is in Texas. They love being able to visit with him, and they wouldn't be able to do that but for the technology that's available at the jail. But I also understand the other side of the coin, which is that whether it's because somebody doesn't have the sophistication to understand the technology, or the family is local and they just want to be able to lay eyes on on their family member. I understand those competing concerns, and I also understand the concern of the sheriff to really protect the inmates from narcotics, weapons, and other contraband that could really pose a serious risk of harm to inmates if they didn't um, have this policy. So they're really significant competing concerns that I think are genuine and real.
So we invited the sheriff on today, and he wasn't able to make it on short notice. But he issued a statement that said, in part, in light of the COVID epidemic, we have made necessary adjustments to our visitation system to prioritize the safety of our employees and inmates housed in our facilities. While in-person visitations are no longer available, we have implemented video visitation as an alternative, and instructions on how to utilize this system are provided within the facility to ensure a smooth and efficient process. Um, JSO offered to take me on a jail tour yesterday, and on very short notice, really just within a matter of hours.
You should do it.
Well, I
Yeah.
did. I did, yeah. So I went
Awesome.
yesterday, but and you can see the physical structure is in need of upgrades. Clearly, that's one of the reasons that they're looking to move, obviously, and getting some money to make some much needed changes in there. But my eyes saw a fairly orderly and functioning facility. It didn't seem in any way to be a problematic environment. And we went to a few floors, so we got to see a little bit of the range of the inmates there. We've got a call from Charles on the west side. Good morning, Charles. Welcome to First Coast Connect.
Good morning. Thanks for having me. It seems to me like the Times-Union did a series not within the last year or so about this company that was providing the communications for inmates in the prison system. I wonder if that's the same company that's trying to do this for the jail. But my comment that I wanted to make also is I used to visit a person in the Lowell Correctional facility down near Ocala, and for contact visits back when they were pre-COVID. And, you had to go through a lot to visit, and you were constantly monitored. There were always – so the jail needs to look at their own people on as to why this fentanyl is being smuggled into jail, because I think it's highly unlikely that any visitors were and here we haven't had any visitors since COVID contact visits, and we still have overdoses happening. So if we don't have anybody coming into the jail to see the inmates, how is the fentanyl getting in?
Right.
So thanks for taking my call.
Thanks, Charles. We also have an email from Michael who says cutting off in-person visits deflects from the actual source of contraband, jail personnel, and won't produce discernible results. Isolating inmates from family and friends will arguably increase violence between inmates and jailers. Nichole, there was an arrest earlier this year of a correctional officer.
There were actually 2 arrests related to drugs getting into the jail. The first one was a correctional officer who began getting investigated in October, was immediately placed on suspension, and then was fired and arrested in April for bringing drugs in. The other person was a City Works employee who worked with inmates, who was also arrested, I believe, also in April, who was found during that overall investigation into the correctional officer.
And what did they find the officers were doing?
I don't know exactly how they were bringing the drugs in. We actually weren't even told what types of drugs they were bringing in, so there were still a lot of questions at the end of that. So yeah, I don't know.
And we don't know whether the fentanyl deaths that you specifically cited were in any way, or no reason to think they were necessarily connected to those arrests.
Right. There's, the sheriff never made that connection, never told us that it was definitely fentanyl. But we just looked at the term of their employment and looked at how many people died of drug overdoses in that time, and made clear that there had been no connection to that.
So your reporting over the past year has looked at the issue of inmate and in custody deaths overall, and some of that looked at, whether the previous medical contractor for healthcare at the jail bore any responsibility And your reporting actually affected a change in that. I mean, the sheriff got rid of that contractor, brought in a new one. Are you seeing changes in terms of the quality of the healthcare provided?
So just looking at the number of deaths, like I said, we had 16 last year. The majority of that was under the care of a company called Armor Correctional Health Services. They are the ones who were contracted in 2017. Originally, that's when we switched to privatized healthcare, and that's when deaths in the jail tripled. The sheriff got rid of that contract and signed one with NAF Care that started in September of last year. So we have seen, if I'm horrible at math, which is why I'm a writer, but looking at 5 deaths so far this year in July versus 16 last year, we have reason to believe that there's going to be less deaths this year.
And what would be a baseline to get, what was prior to the privatization of medical care, about how many deaths were we seeing?
I don't have that number exactly pulled up, but I remember that the numbers were like in the single digits. There was one year where I think we had 4 deaths. There was another year where we had 5. So extremely low compared to the double digits we have seen every year since Armor took over.
When I was visiting yesterday in the jail, there is, a nurse on every floor, in addition to kind of, facilities that they can take them to if that's required. I believe that from information that JSO has sent, that their contention, Andrew, is that the number of deaths that occur in the jail are a lower percentage than the overall deaths that this county experiences. Do you think that's a fair comparison?
Well, let me reiterate. I am a candidate for judicial office. So I really should. I should not answer that question directly.
Let me direct it at Nichole
yeah.
then. I mean, so they basically said that there were out of 25,000 inmates in the year 2023, there was 16 deaths, which represented 0.06% of the inmate population. 10 were due to health issues, 7 of those at a hospital. 3 were due to drugs, 2 were suicide, and then 1 they couldn't determine a cause. And I think JSO rightly points out that the people in jail are not necessarily living their best life when they arrive. I mean, sometimes there are long-time addiction issues. Sometimes they've been living in very extreme situations. We know that the prison population overall, not jail, but prison is an unhealthier population.
Yeah, and that's exactly why you need the right people in there providing, medical care to help these people. And I think when we're looking at the general population versus our incarcerated population, I don't just on, my initial thought think that is a super fair comparison. You and I are not under the government's care right now. And I think that is kind of where the line is making sure that our incarcerated population in the Duval County Jail, in any prison system, is getting the same level of care that they could be getting outside of their confinement.
And when you say that they're under the care, you believe that comes with a greater expectation of care than for you or I?
Well, I've talked to attorneys who have sued different jails all over that I've covered, saying, it's not that we are looking for them to get better care. We're looking for them to get equal care.
Yeah, interesting. So, Andrew Bonderud, nationally and not locally, we've talked about, maybe some challenges to policies like this, but that is not something that would happen on a national basis. Is that right? This really would be a piecemeal legal pushback if these cases made any difference, if they did.
Well, the U.S. Supreme Court has interpreted the Bill of Rights as requiring county sheriffs, really all correctional facilities, to provide for the serious medical needs of all of the inmates who are in their custody. So if there's a serious medical need, the county sheriff, the state penal institution, federal correctional institutions, all of them have this obligation. It's non-delegable, and if an inmate has a serious medical need, then they're on the hook for it.
Is there any consensus as to what is a reasonable amount of money? Obviously these contracts are issued. I believe that some money would reasonably go to the agency that's working with the contractor. Is there any kind of threshold that makes sense for what's appropriate?
Really, that's a policy question. The courts have not weighed in on that. I think there is some recent activity in Florida federal courts that, particularly in the Northern District of Florida, where they considered a lawsuit. It was a class action lawsuit concerning this type of stuff, where the position of the state of Florida was that there wasn't sufficient funds to really provide for the type of medical care that, and it was a specific medical condition that class of inmates were saying we have a need for this health care and we're not getting it. And the federal court judge said, state of Florida, you got to come up with the money for it,
Yeah.
and you got to provide this health care. If they're in custody, you got to take care of them.
Well, Nichole Manna, Andrew Bonderud, thank you both so much for coming on the program today. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much.